We know later from John that it was Peter. We know from the other Gospels that it was one of the disciples. But Mark gives us no clue. One of those standing by. I think he was saying that Peter had become just another part of the crowd. He was deserting Jesus just like everybody else. Whether by accident or intentionally, the high priest's servant has his ear cut off. We don't even read that Jesus put the ear back on. We just read that this is a crazy, wild scene. And everything is coming apart at the seams. And Jesus condemns all of the violence, whether it was by his people or by other people. He says, "Why are you doing this?" And they all forsake him and flee. But God's purpose is being accomplished. We need to really pay attention to that phrase. That this was exactly what God had planned. That the shepherd would be struck and the sheep would be scattered. We need to know that when our world comes apart, God has it all under control. When you're struck by grief, when you're struck by family problems, when you're struck by job problems, when you're struck by marital problems, all of these things, we need to know that God is under control. His purposes are being secured. The last scene, they were all together, and now they scatter. They run to the winds. They hightail it. And then we have a strange little story. First we need to remember Jesus' promise that he will come and gather his sheep together. And then we have this strange little story about the young man who was there, and somebody grabs hold of him, and he runs off without his clothes on into the bushes. Why insert so trivial a detail into so horrible a story? It really is amazing that it's there. Well, some people think that it's like Alfred Hitchcock inserting himself into his movies. This is from Rear Window, and if you've ever seen that movie, in Alfred Hitchcock's movies, he always liked to put himself somewhere in the movie, right? I don't know if you've ever seen him in that. I always pay attention. I think we have all of Alfred Hitchcock's movies, and we pay attention to where he's supposed to be. But, it could be that Mark is inserting himself into the story, that he was the young man. After all, he lived in Jerusalem at the time. He was a young man at the time. But, I don't think Mark would have just said, "Yeah, I was there too." I don't think that answers our question. I think it has more to do with what God has promised before in Scripture. In Amos, it says, "Even the bravest warriors will flee naked." I think this story is the capstone, is the period or the exclamation point that says everybody runs. Maybe Mark's readers are saying, "Did you run?" And he's going, "Yeah, I did." Everybody runs. Every man for himself. Save yourself if you can. Leviticus 26 says, "They will run as though fleeing from the sword, and they will fall even though no one is pursuing them." This is what happens to believers. This is what we are. We are the runners. We are running for the bushes. Because in our own flesh, if we are not prayed up, we are going to head for the trees. The young man is seized and stripped and escapes into the darkness. Jesus is seized and stripped and does not escape, but is crucified in the darkness. Jesus is alone and grieving. And he comes and is arrested. We need to understand what this means to our lives. Only through prayer does he come to the resolution to stand up in this situation. And we need to understand that. When our world is coming apart, only through prayer can we get through this. Waiting can be the most intense of all human emotions. How long have you been waiting for someone to come to know the Lord? How long have you been waiting for God to answer a prayer? Waiting can be the worst part. If you're waiting for tests to come back, if you're waiting for a diagnosis to happen, that's a horrible thing. Let's just get on with it. Start treatment. Start the procedure. I can deal with the surgery, just don't make me wait anymore. Waiting can be horrible. In Gethsemane, Jesus had to wait. Now, when we have to wait, when we face something horrible, a wise person will steel himself, will prepare for the worst. This is what Jesus was doing. He was preparing for the worst, even while he was hoping that it could change. In such hope and prayer, there is no weakness, no failure of nerves. Torn between rational hope and rational dread, one may properly pray for the best while prepared for the worst. This is what we need to do. We need to prepare for the worst even though we are hoping for the best. But in whatever case, we are going to be obedient because we are God's sons and His daughters. We can learn to handle pain and suffering from how Jesus did. First off, He called Jesus Daddy. That means that we can handle pain and suffering if we have that intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. We need to have that relationship in place before the pain starts. Through all the circumstances that God has brought us, we need to have that pain. We need to have built that relationship. We need to be prayed up. We need to be read up. We need to be, have everything in place for when those things happen. We need to have that intimate relationship. We need to understand that other people have prayed to God horrible prayers, exasperated prayers, prayers that blame God because that's what they felt. In prayer, we need to be honest. We need to tell God what we're thinking. We need to do that. And we need to watch. We need to pray. The disciples expected cosmic upheaval when the end of the world was come, when the hour was come. But things are not always that dramatic. In fact, they are often much more subtle. And that's why we need to be praying at all times so that we can see those subtleties that are coming our direction. The disciples didn't recognize the hour was here. They were asleep. Jesus was aware because He was praying. Sleeping here in Mark is a metaphor for a person who is not spiritually aware, who is not spiritually alert. And we need to understand what sleeping means. To sleep is to stop praying. When we stop praying, we are asleep. We're not going to be ready. It's going to sneak up on us. Bad things are going to happen, and we're not going to be prepared. We need to pray. To sleep is to be unable to recognize the onset of the trial or to accept it as God's will. Now, bad things happen, whether you deserve them or not. Bad things happen. It's not a matter of why me, it's a matter of why not me. God tells us that we're in the world and we're going to suffer bad things. We need to accept them as God's will. We need to understand that He brings those into our lives. And we need to recognize when those come. And when we're awake, we can do that. To sleep is to presume that the spirit is willing without being mindful of the weakness of the flesh. Yeah, we are Christians. We have God living in our lives. We are aware that we are spiritually willing. But we also need to be aware that we are also little critters. That we're also human beings who have flesh and blood and have those kinds of weaknesses. The disciples, yeah, they were willing, but they were asleep. To be asleep is to think that you're all spirit and no weakness. We need to understand our weaknesses. To sleep is to assume that we've arrived. That we are as spiritually mature as the most powerful people in the world. Spiritually, we're all grown up, we're all mature, we're all wonderful. We can handle anything. Well, Paul and Jesus are telling us, no, you can't. You need to be awake. And when you're awake, you'll be prepared for the bad things that happen. I don't know if you can see that. Beth was at a family reunion here a couple weeks ago, or a week ago. And she was talking to a couple of her uncles and a couple of her cousins, and they were out hunting. This is not their picture. I just found this one. They were out hunting, and they told one of the uncles, all right, you go and sit over here, and if deer come by you, you warn us. Well, he went over there and sat down and was there, and pretty soon 20 deer come wandering by the people who were hunting. Where's the warning we were supposed to give? Where was the notice that where the deer were? So they went and found the uncle. I can't remember which uncle it was, Uncle Bob or somebody. Uncle Bob was asleep. We need to be watching. It's not necessarily you need to be watching for those cosmic events that will change the world. But we will need to be watching when the deer come sneaking by. We need to be awake, no matter what happens, for those subtle things in our lives that will knock us off course. We need to be awake when Jesus sends trouble.